It's August 1995.
Better and better.
Yeah.
Don't interrupt me.
We're still in the beginning of the Saturn's journey through North America. In the background of corporate struggles to keep stores stocked with consoles and games, Sega's internal game designers are taking us on a journey. In Panzer Dragoon, we were brought to the end of time, an enchanting post-apocalyptic landscape. It hurled players into the deep future of their universe and of 3D graphics, a true taste of what Sega can pull off. Now we're being taken to the very beginning of time, when Goddess first made life. It's appropriately a sprite-based 2D platformer, familiar tech from the start of video games. This is Sega's creation story. Dedicating resources to a two-dimensional game was a risky move at the time. The future of polygon games is now. Sega needs to prove they're capable of delivering 3D and able to compete with the PlayStation, now days away from release. Some question if the Saturn can compete at all in the 3D realm. Others are convinced 3D is a fad and no console could ever do what the arcade cabs can do. But they still went for it anyway and made Astal. It's time to prove they can cater to all hardcore game players, showing us an artistic masterpiece, sprite work that can't be seen in the 16 bits of yesteryear. Space is a lifeless void. The goddess Antiwas used precious gems to create Cortalia, its mountains, land, sea, and trees. From her last two gems, she made Lita and gave her the power to make more life. From the last, she formed Astal and made him extremely strong to keep Lita safe. Dude was a little too dedicated at protecting her and caused a lot of collateral damage. Antiwas got tired of his crap and fell asleep. Meanwhile, the evil god Gerardo is scheming. He made Geist and tasked him with killing Lita. He brought her to the bottom of the sea. Astal went after them and fought so hard, he cracked the bottom of the ocean. You don't f*** with Astal. He freed Lita, ruined the ocean, woke up Antiwas, and she was all cranky, so she banished Astal, defeated Gerardo, fell asleep again, and then Astal starts making his journey back to Lita, and that's where the game begins. From the get-go, the player is punched in the face with a vast color palette. Astal manages to have several large sprites move on screen at once, without ever slowing the console down. Many sounds from the environment, enemies, and incredible soundtrack put the Saturn's audio drivers to hard work. Top it off with a brilliant art style and competent controls, you got yourself a quality platformer. Astal is technological proof that 2D games can not only survive, but thrive in the 5th gen. Regardless, Astal struggles to gain any notoriety in the Western world. It never got a sequel, it was barely written about in magazines, and it's never been ported to any other console in its more than 2 decades of existence. Sales were also not the best. How could this happen with the game so beautifully designed? It has 16 levels, no saves, no checkpoints, and 1 continue if you lose all your lives.
Astal, you mustn't surrender. Have courage.
You start with 4 lives by default, but can go up to 5. A single level takes roughly 7 minutes to beat, so 1 successful playthrough will only take about 2 hours. The later half of this game can be tough as nails, so you're gonna learn by dying. A lot. Astal's default attack is picking up his enemies and f***ing throwing them. You don't f*** with Astal. Pressing attack mid-air will make Astal pound baddies with his 2 fists. This has a generous hitbox and should be a go-to attack. Holding up and pressing attack lets him blow his enemies. If none of these work, just pick up a giant tree. The first level is all about familiarizing yourself with the basic controls and getting the bird. It's a permanent companion.
If you're here to steal the bird, you have to get by me first.
When you kill glowing bad guys, your bird's karma meter fills up. You can then use the bird to either find a health item, do a screen attack, or use a stage-specific ability.
Yatta!
Once you pass the first stage, the rest have their own unique gameplay mechanic. Some examples, a line of deadly bats who move up and down the cave, or an ice level. None of these level styles ever repeat, so gameplay progressively evolves. Things get real tough at the Sea of Clouds, the halfway point. It has a lot of small moving platforms. You die instantly if you fall. The more you play it, the more tricks you pick up and learn how to take advantage of your abilities to make things easier. It will take a lot of trial and error before you're able to get the timing down. Through patience and repetition, Astal becomes a fun experience. The boss fights are a blast. I especially like the behemoth and this fire dragon. There's one fight where the boss captures Astal, and you have to use the bird to kill it. Suddenly learning its controls is really jarring at first. I died a lot here. You don't start to notice the game's true flaws until the third to last level. Here, you have to move under the feet of these giant bugs. The patterns are not consistent. It requires a lot of finesse with the D-pad, causing me to accidentally dash into harm's way. Same issue happens here when you have to quickly go behind rocks and avoid this screen blast. Since Astal's attacks and bird calls make him stand in place, speeding through here is not easy. Generally speaking, Astal's movement is slower than a traditional platformer, but in my opinion, this doesn't hold the game down. It begs the player to practice levels and learn to be precise. Most of the time, platforms are spaced close enough to clear with a walking jump. There's occasionally large gaps that require you to jump off the heads of floating enemies to clear. These obstacles tend to suck eggs in most video games, but Astal makes these more than accessible. If you are a seasoned video game player, you won't have any issues getting used to movement. The only thing that took me some getting used to was the bird and when to use its 3 functions. Finding a balance is kinda tricky. I wound up asking him to find health items most of the time since you only get 3 hit points. The game ends with 2 big boss fights. The large sprites and complex sky graphics really show off how amazing 2D games will look on the Sega Saturn. This whole game is beautifully put together. Crystallized backgrounds and strings of colorful landscapes dazzled me the whole time. It's like I'm playing a painting. According to the credits, it took 5 people to make these amazing backdrops, and they did a more than swell job. You can't avoid talking about the soundtrack in Astal. This dreamy orchestra combined with Pink Floydian guitars blend perfectly with each stage.
I'm going to find Lita or die trying.
The American voice acting is alright.
Astal, please stop.
The Japanese voice acting is kept in the gameplay. It may be somewhat short, but its true flaws are hardly noticeable. Anyone who's ever liked a platformer can enjoy Astal. So surely it must have good review scores, right? Well, that's the thing. In the United States, the few reviews it got were mixed. GamePro seemed to like it. Game Players gave it a bad review, citing sluggish controls. Oddly enough, Astal was brought to Brazil, but not to Europe. Some say it was planned, but just never made it over. Regardless, 3 United Kingdom magazines reviewed it anyway, all negative, complaining about its lack of creativity and bad value for money. I guess if I had to pay $110 to import, I might be upset too. You can also argue it's the dawn of 3D games, and few people wanted another 2D platformer.
Sega Saturn, the most powerful, the most technologically advanced game system.
Stateside, the Saturn is still recovering from a sloppy surprise launch. People who wanted a Saturn still might have a hard time finding one. It still doesn't have a lot of games, and Sega still can't keep up with stock issues. The website Sega Retro calls this a software drought period. There's also strange quirks with the packaging. The game's spine doesn't have the name of the game. Just about every other game spine has the title, not Astal. It's blank. Stores would have to make the cover face outward on the shelves if they wanted to sell any copies. Doesn't help when the cover looks like ass. Here's Japan's cover. Why didn't they just use this? The regional differences don't stop here. In the Japanese version, Astal has 5 hit points. In the States, he has 3. Apparently, making games harder for Western players is common practice. In January of 1996, GamePro published an interview with the Sega away team. In it, producer Dante Anderson said, Japanese audiences like to beat their games more quickly, but Americans want more challenge. The team said Sega would frequently make US versions of Japanese games harder, usually in easy ways like taking away health or adding hit points to bosses. I'm all for a good challenge, but something about this doesn't seem right. I constantly need to send my bird to get health pickups whenever I play Astal. If I had 5 hit points, I could have been using it to attack stuff instead. All the issues with Astal seem to be rooted in marketing more than the actual game. Without judging a book by its cover, regional differences, or lack of availability, it holds its own. Chairman Segata respects Astal's zest for throwing his enemies. The artistry is stunning, and the platforming is divine. If you're a fan of platformers and extremely pretty sprites, I highly recommend Astal. It's a shorty, but it's a goodie. Side note, my personal copy of Astal came with this sweet aftermarket modification. Just look at that ink.